Okay guys, I wanted to tell you all a little bit about the importance of the lens in a camera. And I thought it was proper to bring the biggest camera we have with the biggest lens. This is a Canon XL2 standard definition camcorder. About 5 years ago, this was the Cadillac for prosumer camcorders. Since then, it's been replaced by even tiny little HD cameras. Anyway, I wanted to show you it on a big demo here with a big lens so you can kind of get a perspective of what's happening in automatic mode on some of these smaller cameras. The same principle holds true for video cameras and still cameras. The best way to control your light if you're in manual mode operating these cameras is to adjust what's called your aperture or your iris. It's listed as f-stops on most cameras. You'll have it starts at like an f1.6 and goes all the way up to like an f18. The lower the number, the more open your iris is. And that's important because that's what gives you what's called a shallow depth of field. You probably noticed in the movies, a lot of y'all are fans of Heartland Bowhunter. It has a really shallow depth of field in a lot of their shots where basically your subject is totally in focus and the background is completely out of focus. It makes beautiful shots. That's an intentional maneuver that I'm going to show you how to do with these cameras. The best way to do it is by adjusting your iris all the way open. The more open your iris is, the more shallow your depth of field is going to be. However, there's problems associated with opening your iris all the way. If you're outdoors and you open your iris all the way, it's going to result in overexposure. So there's several ways to compensate for overexposure. One of them is the ND filter. That's my go-to filter. Basically, an ND filter is built into several cameras. It's even built into the smaller cameras. You just don't even know it because it's in automatic mode. The ND filter is like sunglasses for the iris. This camera here has two ND filter settings. They're adjusted right here on the side of the camera. If it's really bright outside, I'll put it on the darkest ND filter. That allows me to leave my iris all the way open, but also it kind of darkens the image so it doesn't come out overexposed. All of these items I'm telling you about that controls the light going into the camera, they all work in conjunction with one another. The most powerful one that I just mentioned, of course, is adjusting your iris. Basically, it's just a circle that gets smaller, kind of like your pupils. And bright light, it gets smaller to let less light in so you're not overexposed. So that's what happens with this camera. There's actually an iris inside, right in front of the lens, that dial's closed if you tell it to when it's really bright outside. The other one, of course, is the shutter speed. Basically, the shutter speed is how long the shutter stays away from the iris, and then it goes back down. If you've got a shutter speed that's open, we typically run on this camera a 1/60th per second shutter speed. It generally creates the best image. But this shutter speeds go all the way up to 1/2400th of a second, which is like really fast. Really fast, and basically I'll use a really fast shutter speed in really super bright conditions because it's letting less light in, therefore it's not going to be overexposed. The last way to control the light in an image, and the reason I'm telling you all this is because it's important for you to understand what your camera's doing. Even if you do have it on automatic mode, it's important for you to understand what's happening behind the scenes. And if you do have a higher end camera, you can control these settings manually. Really, it has real advantages during low light conditions. The other way that you can adjust the signal or the brightness of an image is called the gain. Basically, the gain is just artificially boosting the brightness of your camera. And typically, when you increase your gain, you add artifacts to your video. It gets fuzzy because it's just boosting the signal is all it's doing. However, when it's really low light conditions, I will turn on my gain just so I can see what I'm looking at in my viewfinder. If I had the gain off and was recording in a low light and capturing it, it's not going to add any artifacts. It's just going to be really, really dim. And then I would take it into the editing room and boost it the same way. Basically, if you adjust your brightness in the editing room, you're boosting the gain. That's all your camera's doing. It's doing it internally, though, so you can see what you're looking at. But if you can help it, you never want to use gain until the last resort. I'll walk you through what I do, starting, say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Actually, no, let's back it up. Let's say I'm starting at high noon, and I'm filming in the woods. I'm going to have my aperture at a comfortable level, about midways, and I'm going to have an ND filter on that keeps the image from being overexposed. I'm going to have my shutter speed on about 1/60th of a second. I have my gain turned to 0 because you don't want gain until you have to use it. As the sun starts to set in the sky, the next step I'm probably going to do when the image on my screen gets darker and darker and darker is I'm going to flip that ND filter off. That way there's no sunglasses in front of the lens and it's direct light coming into the iris. As it gets darker and darker and darker, I'm going to have to start opening up that iris a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more to let more light in to compensate for the setting sun. Once you get to a point where you have no ND filters on and your iris is wide open, you have to start doing other measures to compensate to let more light into this lens. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start decreasing my shutter speed. I want the shutter to stay open longer. The problem with letting your shutter stay open longer is that it adds more motion blur to your footage. This camera goes all the way down to 1/8 of a second shutter speed, which is crazy. And if you watch some of the real dark scenes in Bayou Bucks 1 or 2, you'll notice what I call a strobe effect. You'll see a lot of blur to the image, but it's what we had to do to get the shot. The very last thing I'll do as a last resort, after my shutter speed gets down to a level that just looks funny, which is generally less than 1/30th of a second, that's when it typically starts to add that strobe effect. Once it gets to that level, then I'll start adjusting my gain up and up and up. All the way up, I'll boost it up 18 dB, I think is what it's called. And at that point, it adds a whole lot of grainy artifacts to the image. And by that time, when my ND filter is off, my iris is all the way open, my shutter speed is at 1/15th of a second, and I got my gain all the way up, it's pretty much pitch black. And you can barely see anything, and you got to call it a day. Typically, some of the best cameras will fail at about 10 minutes before the human eye fails. So these smaller cameras with a smaller lens, basically the bigger the lens, the better it's going to do in low light conditions. But these smaller cameras are going to fail about 15 to sometimes even 30 minutes before the bigger cameras will. And that's prime time when it comes to deer hunting. Those little Kodak Play Sports are great. So is your iPhone lens. But look at the size of those lenses. They're smaller than a pencil eraser. Therefore, there's not a lot of light that it can gather. And those things, try it right after the sun sets with an iPhone. You'll see that it's really, really dark.